What's up, everyone, and welcome to Weird Westeros, where we go over weird histories, lores, and theories from A Song of Ice and Fire. Just because the show is over doesn't mean we can't still talk Game of Thrones. Today is a supercut of my 4 weirdest structures in A Song of Ice and Fire series. If you've been wanting longer content, this video was made specifically for you. That said, let's get into it. Lorath is one of the 9 free cities of Essos and can be found on an island in the Shivering Sea. The Lorathi lay claim to the Lorath Bay, and fun fact, leviathans, enormous gray whales, can be found there. If you haven't heard, leviathans can be described as the largest and oldest creatures of the world, implying that they are even bigger than their above-land counterparts, dragons. Before the modern-day Lorathi occupied the city, a group of ancient peoples called the Maze Makers once inhabited Lorath. They are called maze makers because they built mazes on the islands in mainland Essos just south. These vast mazes were made of blocks of carved stone that can be found on the islands and in Essos. Lorassian, the second largest Lorathi island, has a great labyrinth, covering 3/4 of its surface with 4 subterranean levels. During the time of the Valyrians, a wooden keep was at the center of this maze and was the seat of Corlin the Great, an Andal warrior who united Lorathi Isles. However, during the scoring of Lorath, Valyrian dragon lords destroyed the keep, burning it down to ashes. The Maze Makers unfortunately have left no written records explaining the purpose of these mazes, but many current-day scholars have their speculations. Large bones have been found in the mazes, so some speculate the mazes were built by larger men. Taking this a step further, some believe the Maze Makers were born of human men and female giants. Archmaester Quillen believes the foundation of Hightower is either connected or was built by the Maze Makers. He believes this because of its labyrinthine nature, but no other evidence is available beyond that. Legend says the Maze Makers disappeared because they were killed off by the creatures of the sea, also known as the Deep Ones. The Great Empire of the Dawn is an old and ancient empire that once existed prior to the Golden Empire of ET. Spanning from the Bones to the Grey Waste, from the Shivering Sea to the Jade Sea, the god on Earth ruled over this dominion for 10,000 years. Being the only begotten son of the Lion of Night and Maiden Maid of Light, the Great Empire of the Dawn flourished in peace, and once he ascended to the stars to join his forebears, he left the empire to his eldest son, who became known as the Pearl Emperor. The Pearl Emperor is attributed by many to being the builder behind the 5 forts, a massive fortress of citadels that line the northeastern boundaries of the Golden Empire of ET, situated between the Bleeding Sea and the Mountains of the Morn. These citadels are made of fused black stone and sit 1,000 feet high. Because of the material the forts are made of, some attribute their creation to the Valyrians, but there is no record of Valyrians visiting that area during their time of reign. The 5 forts are famously known for defending against the demon of the Lion of Night during the Long Night that was infamously brought about by the Bloodstone Emperor, the last known ruler of the Great Empire of the Dawn. When the Bloodstone Emperor usurped the throne from his sister, the Amethyst Princess, he began a reign of complete terror. Practicing the dark arts, torture, and necromancy, he single-handedly brought about the Long Night through the terror he caused. The Maiden of Light, disgusted by the evil that he had unleashed on his people, turned her back upon the world, allowing the Lion of Night to come forth and punish the wickedness of men. No one knows how long this darkness lasted, but Azor Ahai was able to root out the darkness, bringing back light into the world. Though civilization survived and was able to rebuild after the Long Night, the Great Empire of the Dawn did not endure. The world that remained after the Long Night was splintered, and from this, the Golden Empire of ET was created. The Yiddish like to think of themselves as the descendants of the great empire of the Dawn, and in a way they are, but they have never reached the Dawn's previous heights of power and riches in Essos. Though Yi is still by far one of the richest and most powerful cultures in Essos, it is still nothing compared to the great empire of the Dawn. Now, the 5 forts of the Great Empire of the Dawn are regulated to guarding the Golden Empire from raiders out of the Great Waste. The Night Fort is the oldest and greatest of all of the castles on the wall, and was for thousands of years the chief seat of the Watch, to protect the wall and man against their most powerful foe, the Others. But instead it would become legendary because of a dark incident in its past. Archmaester Harmon wrote Watchers on the Wall, a recounting of the infamous tale of the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, the Night's King. At the center of this was the Night's Fort. The Night's King, whose original name has been erased from history, bedded a sorceress, pale as a corpse, and declared himself king and ruled the Night's Watch from the Night Fort for 13 years. Taking this sorceress as his corpse queen, they ruled together until they were dethroned by Brandon the Breaker and Juraman, the king beyond the wall. Leaving a permanent scar on the legacy of the Night Fort. The Night's King, however, wasn't the undoing of the Night Fort. It ultimately fell to the dwindling power of the Night's Watch. For as many men as the Night Fort could hold, it over time was garrisoned by a tiny fraction of what it was. Since it was also costly to maintain, Alysanne Targaryen convinced Lord Commander Lothar Burleigh to abandon the fort for a smaller and newer castle, Deep Lake. Now, the Night Fort lies in ruins. It's full of broken towers, a maze of tunnels, and yards that have become small forests, with a twisted weirwood growing through a hole in the kitchen. It's home to nature, ghosts, shadows, and things that come in the night. A once glorious fortress, it now lives with the stained legacy of housing the very enemy it was meant to destroy. For today's segment, we will travel all the way to Old Volantis, where we see yet another structure made of fused black stone. Volantis is one of the free cities that we find in Essos. It is a large port city on the southernmost coast where the Rhoyne River touches the Summer Sea. Sir Jorah Mormont tells us this about Volantis. Volantis is the oldest and the first colony of Valyria. After the Doom, the Valentines tried to rebuild the empire under their rule. They failed, not least because the last Valyrian with dragons, Aegon Targaryen, entered the war against them. Now they are content to dominate only their lower classes, or so they say. After the doom of Valyria, colonies experienced a bit of chaos since there were no longer any centralized Valyrian leadership. Seeing the opportunity to seize power, land, and riches, the ancestors of the current leadership of Volantis built armies to forge a new Valyrian empire. But, as Sir Jorah Mormont tells us, Aegon Targaryen, the last Valyrian with dragons, sided with Volantis' enemies and crushed their conquest. This struggle by the firstborn of Valyria, the Volantis of old, to reforge a new Valyrian empire became known as the Century of Blood and resulted in a decades-long series of chaotic wars between Volantis and the other free cities. Since then, the descendants of the Valyrians, the Old Blood, kept to themselves, only seeking to subjugate the lesser classes from behind their magnificent black wall. The main subject of our video today. It is a towering structure built some 200 feet high and built many centuries ago when the world was a different place and the old dragon lords were expanding their empire and were threatening to shape the world in their own image. This structure is nearly as wide as it is tall and can fit 6 4-horse chariots side by side. Because of this, Volantis conducts chariot races to annually celebrate its founding. Only scions of the old blood who can trace their ancestry to Valyria are allowed to dwell here in what they call the heart of Atlantis. And inside of the walls, you will find wonderful palaces, courtyards, towers, temples, cellars, everything you can imagine in a fortress. In the book A Dance with Dragons, chapter 14, Tyrion tells us that the Triarchs of Atlantis, which is a title held by the 3 elected leaders of the free city of Atlantis, once ruled Lys, Myr, and Volantis from within the Black Wall for 2 generations. But this ended when the Tiger faction of Atlantis was eventually defeated by a coalition when they attempted to conquer Tyrok. Now, unless you are invited by an old blood, no foreigner is allowed in the Black Wall. Very few people are even allowed to vote for the Triarchs, but if you are a woman of good birth who dwells in the ancient palaces, you are allowed to vote. The Black Wall and those who dwell in it reinforce a class system for the people of Atlantis, and this causes many divides, including the gods that you worship. For example, R'hllor is the god worshipped and favored by the classes that live outside of the walls, who are typically slaves or freedmen, while the aristocracy living within the walls kept to the old gods of Valyria. Again, in A Dance with Dragons, we meet a famous, or one could argue infamous, freed person of Atlantis named the Widow of the Waterfront, who helps Ser Jorah Mormont and Tyrion Lannister travel to Meereen to meet Daenerys Targaryen. The Widow of the Waterfront is infamous because of her climb to power. At first, she was a pleasure slave who, while living in Yunkai, learned the way of the 7 sighs. After some time, however, she was purchased by Vogaro, a Triarch of Atlantis who fell in love with her. Vogaro freed her, and the 2 married, causing a great scandal in Volantis. The old blood disliked her so much, they referred to her as Vogaro's whore behind her back. And even after inheriting the wealth of her husband once he died, she was not able to live inside of the walls, because no freed person is ever to have that privilege. The Black Walls are old and towering, but still serve a purpose to this day. But if there's anything we learn from history, the only thing for certain is change. Silhoris Cavo Nargaris reveals to us how Daenerys' smashing of the slave trade has affected those living behind the Black Wall. Behind the Black Wall, lords of ancient blood sleep poorly, listening as their kitchen slaves sharpen their knives. Volantis may be one of the more powerful free cities with the largest population, but 80% of that population is actually made of slaves, leaving the old bloods vulnerable to the will of many if they are not able to quell their powers of numbers and their need to be free. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will we see a slave rebellion in Volantis? Do the old bloods really have to worry about civil unrest? Or should they watch their backs at night lest they become victims to their own greed and need for power? Let's get some discussions going below. If you've made it this far, I made this video specifically for you, so thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned for more installments because I have a lot more to cover. Thanks.